but they had active, passive, and PNF style stretches. So there was some versatility from that perspective. And what they showed is that the changes, they managed to elicit changes in range of motion, and that corresponded to changes in the sprint cycle, that there was less strain.
Okay.
And this took place in both groups, but I should emphasize that this also took place in the strength group. So strength training also can improve, but there's less, let's say, strength training is more fatiguing. So this is good news where you can do less fatiguing training and it can elicit a potential positive change.
That was Johan Lahti. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, Simplifaster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but Simplifaster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle stimulators and more. Some products of Simplifaster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in K-Box, or coaches' favorites such as GymAware. Recently, Simplifaster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make Simplifaster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at simplifaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. When it comes to sports injury mitigation and injury prevention, I have such a huge respect just for the job of the body in controlling all the little muscles and big muscles in a way that helps us to be explosive and do the job that we need to, but also just riding this razor's edge of not blowing ourselves apart. When we look at the massive, not only forces the body has to deal with, but also the timing on just the millisecond or even less level that the body has to quickly engage and disengage muscles. It's absolutely incredible. And looking at the hamstrings particularly, it is amazing, not only just the sagittal plane or the front to back, but also the rotational component of this muscle group and how it works to help us perform as athletes is absolutely amazing. And looking at that razor's edge, it's no question why the hamstrings are often frequently injured. And when it comes to hamstring injuries, taking a multifaceted and a holistic approach is so helpful. It's easy to talk just about like a singular thing, like a singular element of running technique and Nordic hamstrings. But it's also enjoyable to have to talk about everything we can think of when it comes to hamstrings and hamstring injury in the same conversation. A fantastic guest that we have who's going to help us with just that is Johan Lahti. Johan is a strength coach from Finland who is not only a strength coach, but also a hamstring researcher who he is pursuing his Ph.D. on a multifactorial approach for hamstring injury risk and is doing so under the mentorship of prior podcast guest J.B. Morin. Johan is a practitioner who truly has a hand in both the worlds of the art and the science of athletic development. And it's these shows where we're talking methods, but we're also talking research, and we're putting the two together and figuring out where these, how in these two fields interact, the qualitative and the quantitative. On today's podcast, Johan is going to tell us about the ideas of strength and technique in the weight room, not just exercises, but how an athlete's technical proficiency and how they're executing various exercises may play a role in potential hamstring issues. Johan is also going to talk about running technique, mobility and flexibility, proprioception, cognitive demand, and really the big picture of how all these might interact when it comes to hamstring injury risk prevention. So this is a great coaching podcast for your toolkit and hamstring injury risk and just understanding some of these concepts on a global level as well. It was awesome to have Johan on the show. Let's get on to it. Johan, it's great to have you here. I love doing shows on hamstrings and hamstring injury prevention. I think that if I did shows on like bicep tear injury prevention, I feel like it just wouldn't get quite the community and the audience listening. Hamstrings are always fun to talk about, and obviously they're a really important injury to learn to prevent. But before we get started with the questions, could you tell me a little bit about what drew your interest to your field of research and application with the hamstrings?
Yeah, great question. Actually, it got a nostalgic feeling directly. I initially found interest in the hamstrings by one of my first mentors in Canada when I was an exchange student in 2011. His name was Paul Balsam, and it's not this one in Sweden, or is he in Sweden right now? I don't know. Maybe in England, actually. Sorry about that if I'm mixing. But he was a rugby strength and conditioning coach, mostly in the UK, and moved to Canada. And he had a fascination for hamstring function and how it contributes to propulsion and acceleration, and using that as a stable to how the muscle's complexity is really interesting and how it is responsible for directing force quite efficiently between the hip and knee. So there was so much to learn, and so we knew so little. So that was very fascinating. And then it just stuck with me when I went to do my master's in Jyväskylä, and Andres Hagi, that you have as a guest here too. He was doing high density EMG for the hamstrings, and that was really fascinating. Of course, there was a lot of other things going on with the hamstrings there, so that just obviously just more fuel to the fire. And then I went back to Canada to learn even more for a year. I took a gap year so I could continue learning from my mentors there, including Paul. And then I guess I was just permanently stuck with that, happy, of course. And there were so many unanswered questions that could be answered within the scope of a master's that I thought it would be logical to continue with a PhD. And stumbling upon JB Morin's research during my years in Canada and during my master's was evident or inevitable. And I contacted him, and long story short, it ended with collaboration and continuing with the hamstring theme, but a bit differently.
So one of the things that I'm excited to ask you, because I know when we did I know for the Friday 5 question and answer, you were talking about, or one of the questions was strength versus running technique. And I think that when it comes to hamstring injuries, I think it's really easy to probably get on one side or the other. Do we need to look at specific muscles, or do we need to look at a technique that's causing injury? How do you go about, and I don't necessarily want to like pit one against each other, but how do you look at that equation with strength versus running technique in hamstring injury prevention?
It's a very good question, and it directly gets quite difficult to keep structured, just because already the word strength includes so many. It's quite an abstract term, as you know. It's difficult to define well, as somebody can have, let's say, if you're doing a squat, a force plate can read a specific Newton output, but they can produce that force by different strategies. So let's say one has a bit more valgus, one has a bit more hip shift, but the end result is the same in terms of Newton. So, but are they technically producing strength for different tasks, even though it's defined as a squat? So that is really interesting, and I think that should be discussed more. That's why I don't like to too much separate strength from technique, as I think they're entwined in some way, but evidently, or it needs to be done in terms of research. That's why I kind of like to talk about force production, so that strength doesn't get mixed in. if I give an example from the track world, doing, A skips with really good technique, I think my glute med is on fire after that sometimes, or other drills. And I would consider that there are elements of strength there, or strength improvement, even though it's considered a technique drill. So really, depending on the athlete, there might be, a strength stimuli. So that's why it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah. So basically,
do you agree?
Yeah. Basically, you're saying there's, and in terms of just like typical strength, like a squat, that may not display the strength that an athlete is actually using when they run. Is that basically what you were getting at there?
Well, yeah, that's maybe as if you're using the squat as an example, one interesting thing is that if somebody's squat technique, let's say in a split squat, this was a bit what I was discussing in the 5 text, is that you can maybe to some extent predict how someone's going to move during sprinting based on their split squat technique or even their squat technique. But yet we define it more of, how much load he's lifting up and down, or center of mass is moving up and down. But, there's so many different strategies to do it, but the end result is the same, So that's why I like to keep that in mind while we're discussing the strength versus technique aspect.
Oh, gotcha. All right. So that makes sense to me for sure. I've heard Dan Fichter, who one of the very first shows we did, talked about, he's like, I can see your running technique in an isometric lunge hold or a split squat hold. And I think, be it a iso lunge or a split squat variation, I think we definitely see things that always show up in like the folded up positions, the midair positions, what's your joint range of motion. So it's funny because I was actually going to almost ask that more from the sense of like Nordic hamstrings would be the typical, like, oh, if you can do Nordics, then you're strong in the posterior chain. And I mean, part of that might be too, like some people would arch their back more for a Nordic hamstring. So I definitely agree with you there. Like because what is strong? Like if I am doing a squat or even a split squat and I lift more weight, but I'm really arching my back to do it, or I'm not giving myself a lot of joint variability where I don't have a lot of movement options, I imagine that, yes, weight was lifted, but how effective is that strength in carrying over to running on the field in different directions where I'm going to be called to have more joint variability because I have to make sudden shifts or various things. So I like that idea of that from that standpoint, the strength and the technique. How might that fit with a Nordic hamstring or posterior chain or Romanian straight leg deadlifts or anything like that? How would we factor in looking at more quote unquote specific hamstring strength work into that?
Yeah, it's again a really good question. I typically think of it now as those exercises as, although they can influence in some individuals intermuscular coordination, they're intramuscular focused, and therefore it's smart to try to use your time efficiently where you're trying to stack different stimuli together. So let's say hamstrings wise, it's a 2-joint muscle. Could I use exercises also that stimulate both the hip and knee at the same time? So I'm stacking using my time efficiently. Whereas, a Nordics, which I don't want to give the image that I would not use them as we do use them. It's in our research protocol for hamstring injury risk reduction. I just want to give it as an example where, although you could argue for many benefits and it's tons of research supporting it, you're isolating really the knee flexors there. So, but even the Nordic group don't emphasize any point that you only should use the Nordic. So that's already, I think, quite established. But it's good to try to think of an intramuscular stimuli that takes into consideration all the muscle groups that support the hamstrings or the muscle tendon units and the hamstring heads themselves. So different tasks, as we know, different exercises stimulate maybe the biceps long head, femoris long head a bit differently than the semitendinosus, and maybe even from a different region of the muscle. So, but these kind of things I think are good to think about.
The part of my brain that always wants to say what is better, which I know when we're talking about this, it's about everything. Like I want to get into your protocol, but I think about people like to just go to exercises and just outputs, like how good is your Nordic? Can you touch your nose to the ground? What does the Nord board say? Or things like that. And I think that's good to be able to do those things. But it's also, I mean, I think that I would take an athlete who can do a really good split squat and have a good like stacked rib cage and show good mastery over the range of motion. I mean, that there's a few more elements that you can't really put a number on. I mean, you could, but it's just knowing how to observe movement that I think that's really important too. I guess it's not a question of, my mind always wants to say, well, I'm biased towards saying, well, all coaches should be really good at observing movement, and so this is better, And I think they're probably both very important. You probably want to have all of them in your system. Like you want to be good at Nordics, you want to be good at doing your split squats with technique that carries over to running and everything.
Yeah. And I forgot to say that was a really good point with even in exercise, an isolated exercise as Nordics. I feel that you can predict movement based on how the people like to shift their pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt on that exercise. And I feel that is kind of present or predictable. One aspect that can maybe predict movement choices when more dynamic tasks are done, where hamstrings need to be utilized in a high level. So it is really interesting that, these kind of simple tasks that we consider help give us some holistic even information or broader information. But it's difficult to answer that question of what is the most optimal exercise. I think if you're ticking those boxes, then you could argue that some exercise is doing enough if you have other exercises that are ticking the rest of the boxes.
Sure. I like what you said about the Nordics too. I've mentioned that on the show before, the idea of like the back arching, but I think it'd be very interesting to, I don't know, like I mean, it's hard to decide exactly why someone had an injury, but I think it'd be interesting to watch people do a Nordic hamstring and to notice strategies and almost mark down, like this group was a back dominant anterior tilt strategy when they did the movement, and this group had more mastery over the pelvis, and then see if that played into who might have had an injury or not throughout the year. I'd be curious. I mean, you probably could see it in running mechanics in certain situations potentially too, or if the hamstrings were called on for a high load, maybe that would be the shift. But yeah, I think that would be interesting. I mean, I have no idea. It's like you watch someone do a Nordic hamstring, and if they're just arching their back real hard, that's clearly not a good thing. So it'd be interesting.
Yeah, then it becomes again about that aspect of, like I was talking about the squat, that you're getting up and down, but how are you doing it? So that is, especially in these kind of super maximal exercises, you would think it's quite evident that these kind of improficiencies should be considered. I tried to put a sensor actually on the pelvis in one of my, we were doing some pilots for the screening protocol, and we have this pelvis sensor that is a goniometer also. And yeah, I was trying to see that if I could, when people are doing maximal knee flexions, if they choose more or less a strategy where they shift their pelvis more into anterior pelvic tilt, and could that give some, controlling for that confounding factor? But it's so much work. Mm-hmm. It took so long to do that I didn't really have time for. Well, I didn't have time for it. So it is definitely you're on point there. There's so much money going into hamstring research. I wouldn't be surprised if someone picks up that as a research topic.
Yeah, maybe tries to make it a little more time efficient. I think a lot of that stuff, with all the things the human body can do, you could measure so many things, right? It's just probably more about finding like the smaller, like big rocks, and just knowing how to assess those well.
Yeah, exactly. Like our time is such of high value. Like we can create these great protocols in the lab, gold standard equipment, but then what's the use if teams don't have the budget or time or resource, or facilities to conduct these tests? So a lot of this stuff needs to be a lot of technological advancement that we can get, advanced or more with less testing, a good idea of what's going on. That would be the end goal, right? So I don't have to do 20 indirect tests to get an idea. We want to get closer and closer to what's going on, but that's so difficult right now with the technology we have. And we can discuss that. I think that's an interesting topic to discuss, what are some potential ideas for the future. But that's interesting.
So the other half of that was like the running mechanics. And I know you'd mentioned it, like you're going to see, however an athlete runs, you're going to see a lot of that stuff show up in various positions in the gym setting in terms of their joint options. But in terms of like on-field running technique, I mean, anterior pelvic tilt's always the big one people talk about. What have you guys looked at for looking at the link between running technique and hamstring injury, and if there's any low-hanging fruits there that really stand out?
Yeah, well, our strategy was just as technological restrictions didn't allow us to have that anterior pelvic tilt is measured with a Vicon system, 3D kinematics, which is a very time consuming to say the least. And it's great stuff, but yet it's not practical in real life settings. And therefore we need advancements where IMU sensors can be even on the athletes during maybe practice, but we're not there yet. So right now we're at the point where we need to have like indirect measurements that can be done quickly on the field, and we're just simply measuring them from the sagittal plane. And based on some studies that support the idea that you can watch the thigh or knee movements, and you can it can be associated with their pelvic position. And if you look at this anterior pelvic tilt study, the famous one by Schwemmers et al. In 2017, they have a sagittal plane picture of the 3D kinematics. And what you can see is it's a very, it looks like this kickback mechanism is taking place in this athlete with a more pronounced anterior pelvic tilt. So it's very interesting if there's some connection here, and then that and a lot of anecdotes by different coaches and some biomechanical studies support the evidence-guided, has face validity, at least, where it could be of value just quickly looking at how their thighs are moving in the sagittal plane, and if that's predictive of injury.
I wanted to take a break from the show and briefly share with you the difference that performance herbalism can make for you. Several years ago, I had Logan Christopher, CEO of Lost Empire Herbs, on the show to talk about hypnosis and mental training for athletes. While talking to him, I realized he also had an herbalism company. So shortly thereafter, I used the Phoenix formula, which was my first product I bought from them. I had great results with it, not only increasing my energy and decreasing my need for coffee and caffeine, but I also noticed that it was making an impact on my lifts and my weight room numbers. I was having a great training experience. Shortly thereafter, I also got into the Shilajit resin as well as other herbs. And I don't look at supplementation the same way. I'm a strong believer in what Logan and his company are doing in looking for a natural resource to boost human performance. If you want to check out the herbs that I use personally from Lost Empire Herbs, you can head to www.lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can get 15% off your order, and they offer a 365-day money-back guarantee. Definitely check them out. Let's get on back to the show. Yeah, the kickback indicating the tilt and stuff like that. I could definitely see that. And we just had a podcast with Joel Reinhardt and Andrew Cormier, and they were talking about how women's field hockey players, when basically you're running with a stick in front of you, or Cam Jossa talked about his med ball knee punch runs where you hold a med ball in front of you. But basically when you're running and there's something in front of you, he had mentioned those girls in the game would exhibit better, they wouldn't have that back kicking mechanic as much, because it's almost like they have a sensation and a weight in front to bring everything back around and probably help that core get stacked up for someone who might not be so good at that. So it's interesting. It'd be interesting too, just look at like, hamstring injury in field hockey perhaps too, versus a different sport where the norm is to be in a different position on account of what you're running with. I mean, I'm sure when you run, it might be different, but I mean, it'd be just an interesting thought that popped in my head to cross-check across sports where you might be holding something in your hands versus where you're not.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I also saw Cameron's presentation with this ball holding in front, and I've tried it myself, and it's brilliant stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always like using an external stimuli or something that gives an athlete something to wrap around. And first, I'll go there first versus necessarily trying to coach things or automatically coach things or tell athletes to have things in their head while they're operating. I wanted to ask you about one thing I thought was really fascinating that you've written about was mobility. And I believe the idea that being more mobile is good for not hurting yourself with the hamstring perspective, but stretching to get there doesn't help. Or could you clarify that? How does that all break down when it comes to hamstring injuries and mobility?
Yeah, so it's kind of like I classify this also as like an intramuscular stimuli, not coordination wise, but intramuscular, where we're trying to manipulate the tissue to achieve a certain outcome. And in this sense, there's supportive biomechanical evidence for lengthening the angle of peak torque in the hamstrings with range of motion training. So then that would mean that, and also additionally, that your range of motion is moderately correlated with how much strain, mechanical strain or lengthening past optimal length takes place during sprinting. So changing this by changing that peak angle of torque means that there's less strain during sprinting as you produce a peak torque at longer lengths. So this has been recently shown by Juan et al. Those references are in that text, and really fascinating studies. And the fact with range of motion training is that, well, we have to remember that we shouldn't just consider the hamstrings. We should consider other muscles that influence the hamstrings. That modeling studies have shown that muscles that basically can pull contribute to lengthening the hamstrings, and the hip flexors are most famous, or iliopsoas. So these kind of things need to be considered, that we don't too much isolate that. But basically what we're trying to achieve is maybe through change that peak angle of torque, have some reduce maybe that viscoelasticity, so that through maybe fluid shifts where there's not so much stiffness in the tissues within the muscle tendon units. But it should be emphasized here that it's really important to actually control. I was writing this in the text, that it's really important to measure pre and post here, that are you eliciting change in your range of motion exercises, kind of like Kelly Starr does. There's a pre and post, and it shows that, now the range of motion is this much. So then the likelihood of it not just being increased pain tolerance, but there's actually a physiological change is more, there's a higher likelihood for this. And I think when we do range of motion exercises for our athletes, there's a lot of slacking off, and it's not very intense. And there could be, but if we, in an ideal scenario, range of motion exercises are very easy to do, as you know, and can be conducted really often because the neuromuscular fatigue component is so low.
Sure. So I'm trying to clarify this with because I was under the impression that, I think in a study you highlighted was saying that athletes who have more range of motion won't get hurt as much. I'm assuming it's in the hamstrings or hip flexors, they have less chance of injury, but athletes who stretch statically to acquire better range of motion, it doesn't help them. Am I wrong on that, or is that correct?
Well, there was two studies, or actually three, but two, I think. Let me see if I'm summarizing them correctly. So one showed that the range of motion in a straight leg raise task was moderately correlated or with how much length change past optimal length you're experiencing during sprinting. So as hamstring injuries typically happen during the terminal swing phase, where there's some lengthening of the hamstrings past optimal length, then the theory of this first study is that, well, when we screen our athletes and they have good range of motion, maybe there's a smaller likelihood that there's a large strain during each stride of the sprint cycle. And then they did a second study where they did an intervention and tried to manipulate this range of motion. And they had one group that just did strength training, and also at different lengths. And the range of motion training was versatile, although they didn't they didn't consider the hip flexors to that much. They had a lunge position at least, but they had active, passive, and PNF style stretches. So there was some versatility from that perspective. And what they showed is that the changes, they managed to elicit changes in range of motion, and that corresponded to changes in the sprint cycle, that there was less strain.
Okay.
And this took place in both groups, but I should emphasize that this also took place in the strength group. So strength training also can improve, but there's less, let's say, if strength training is more fatiguing. So this is good news where you can do less fatiguing training and it can elicit a potential positive change.
Interesting. Was the strength training, I'm assuming it was probably maybe like full range of motion, split squat type stuff, or was there a particular range assigned to the strength training group?
Yeah, good question. I remember that they had at least a couple of different exercises. One of them was the Nordic, but I think there was some bridge type exercises, but not to what I remember anything at extreme lengths, training. I don't remember that there being, any 45-degree angle hip or back extension, or maybe there was, but nonetheless, I cannot answer that without digging the study. But the strength protocol was, let's say, it seemed quite normal, what you would see in some cohorts training.
Sure.
So it was interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Yeah, I'd be interested to check that out, just because I do think I am biased to not prioritize static stretching, just because my mind is always, if you can get it through just going through larger ranges of motion in your strength training itself, you're kind of ticking that box. But I'm always curious of the utility of different things at different times too. And so it makes sense. That actually takes me to, and I'm not saying I wouldn't ever use static stretching. I like body weight isometric holds and stretch ranges and that kind of, it is kind of stretching. I don't know, maybe it's just semantics, but I would be curious as to the range of that was utilized. But it does make me think of, and I want to say maybe JB Morin told me this, or I forget exactly where, but I think it was something to the tune of the Nordic hamstring increases the fascicle length of the hamstrings, but also max velocity sprinting does the same thing. Like if you just do max velocity sprint work, that your hamstring muscles, the fascicles will get a little bit better at end range just organically because you are sprinting faster. Do you have any thoughts on that idea? I guess that fits with the strength training element, that there was some length improvements or something, but what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, and I will answer that question quickly after adding a comment about the range of motion. That I also agree on the static stretching component, that I would prefer to use dynamic stretching and maybe trying to think of some kind of direct isolation. So maybe trying to emphasize that pelvic placement between the hip flexor and the hamstrings, and using coordination to hold posterior pelvic tilt when there's such a bias in certain sports to shift anteriorly. So these kind of things, there's more details to the range of motion, definitely. And I just wanted to emphasize that point there. And it's easy. People usually connect it directly just to the static part. So that is an interesting discussion of when not to do static.
Yeah, so you're saying that static doesn't guarantee you're going to control any range well. You could be, maybe you increased your range, but you could still be kind of flopping around from a coordination pelvis standpoint when you need to be in good positions, versus doing something that's more whole body. When you're doing it dynamically, there's much more coordination required to utilize this range of motion.
Yeah, and rarely would it be considered a supportive method, I think. It wouldn't be a primary method, but strength training that's an example of a primary method, and then you would have supportive by just because of what the game does and what the stiffness increases from just playing the sports, and then the fatigue component. Then that's why it's a practical supportive method, range of motion training to some extent. And then you could argue about how you're doing it, of course. But that's more maybe I wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah. I
But
think
you were asking about yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think a lot about just an athlete in their pure natural state, or even just like a caveman. Like, does a caveman need to stretch, his or her hamstrings to be the best? You know what I'm saying? Like, if an athlete's doing all these things, or even in max velocity sprinting, the hamstrings are naturally adapting to that stimulus by increasing their fascicle length on their own. I mean, I'm sure that probably having better mechanics is probably going to be a better thing there with that adaptation. But I always just feel like I'm always trying to think of ways to reduce the noise in the system. If we don't need to do something, or if there's a faster, better way to do something, I want to do that.
Yeah, it's a fair argument point. Absolutely. Like, some physiotherapists say they don't do much range of motion training anymore, and especially static stretching. And I would disagree in that sense that there's, in certain cohorts like football, I consider it a practical tool during the weekly mesocycle or the mesocycle and microcycle, that is. So I would be able to debate about that, but yeah, I wouldn't have strong opinions about it, because if you're again ticking the boxes with other methods, then fine. I'm just not convinced that it's easily replaceable due to that fatigue component. And also these interesting things that what are all the things that influence range of motion, and you've had guests a lot with that try to narrow well, there's a lot of reflexive, it's trending right now with the reflexive methods, are RPR, I believe, and this Chris Corfists and Tal Dietz stuff, and they're basically showing that if you just manipulate these small things, your range of motion changes by that, and just by warming up the body itself, your range of motion improves. So this is interesting also, that our range of motion exercise is actually just functioning because you're increasing heat in the muscle. So these kind of discussions are very relevant, and will be nice to debate more in the future. But yeah, you were asking about the fascicle components and sprinting versus isolated work.
Yes.
Yeah. So animal studies also seem to support this, where we're doing sprinting, that there's these. Well, what we're trying to do with fascicle testing is, as you probably know, the sarcomere number in series. We're trying to increase that, or maybe even increase the specific length of a sarcomere. We don't really know what's happening, so that's why it's indirectly by fascicle length measuring. And it's an interesting one, where in one animal study using guinea pigeons, I can't remember how it went, where they had them run one control group, and another one did basically these hurdle types of sprints. They then did the cadavers. Unfortunately, they had to kill the birds, and so sorry, that was a bummer. But yet we got clear evidence from the cadavers that the sprinting group had much longer fascicle lengths afterwards, and this has now become something of interest also. By Jordan Mendigucha published that study last year, where there was substantial changes in fascicle length from a sprint program, and to some extent more, I think, even than the Nordic group. And again, you need replication studies for this kind of stuff, because it's difficult to measure fascicle length accurately with the equipment we have these days, and because the hamstrings are quite complex with three-dimensionally, so there's rotation of the fascicle also, and it's difficult to control for this and with 2D ultrasound. But there is a huge discussion base right now of what's the role with changes in fascicle length, and also with the Blasevich's team and colleagues are trying to also look at what's maybe the role of these gear ratios. So you could argue also that a higher pennation angle in some cases protect from lengthening also, or fascicle lengthening, that is. So that's that topic gives headaches easily. So I would say right now, though, it seems that there's benefit of increasing both a bit, fascicle length and pennation angle, depending on what head we're talking about in the hamstrings. But Yeah, I tend to, as I have not studied that specifically, I tend to just lean on the broader picture where it's just good to be good at the task that's required. So sprinting a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I do think about, the idea of reducing noise in the system. I guess ideally, in the perfect world, you just manage stress well, you run with good technique, and your body just adapts, and you don't really need to do too much extra. Like I was just talking with coaches recently about this, is like just how much, I mean, like bulletproofing is the big thing. And I don't disagree with it, like all these special exercises designed to help protect muscle groups. But at the end of the day, I would value doing big rock things with better technique and being able to manage the pressures in the body and the angles and the skeleton better in those versus having a misaligned skeleton or body angles or bad running technique and then doing all the bulletproofing. Because then you're just like, there's so much stuff going on. Maybe you're holding it together, but I feel like that strain also could impact like your longevity, or you might, I mean, it's just so much more energy to keep that system running versus just getting to like the bigger, more core components. And I think, and it sounds like, I think that's what we're doing, and the research is leading us towards that. I was going to say too, just a side note, is I'm trying to picture birds running over hurdles. I think that would be, I don't know how they made them do that, but it's interesting.
I haven't read that study now in a while, so I could be remembering something something wrong, but I swear there was something like a component of this.
If you could send it to me, if you can find it, send it to me. I would be very curious about that. It just seems like I'm trying to picture birds like I don't even know what their mechanics. I mean, I feel like their legs almost go the other way or something, or they have a really long like foot that just. I'm curious what the kinematics would be, but I don't know.
Yeah. But you're correct with the emphasizing the word animal studies there. So again, we cannot predict or associate the results for humans, as you know. So or strongly associate the
it's different
results.
Structure. Yeah.
But they do, of course, give a very support and evidence guided decision in further researching it in humans.
Yeah. I mean, I could definitely see the mechanism in humans of just adapting too. It's like, okay, if sprinting is going to place a greater load, especially with that swing leg coming through, if it's going to demand a lot out of your hamstrings have to adapt somehow to that. And so I think that, and I always like thinking about what Rafe Kelly has said. He's, I think, back on the podcast well over a year ago, but the idea of almost like working at the level of the highest coordination, and that rising old ships rather than like a lower coordination, like a lot of extra bulletproofing you don't need. That's really low coordination. Is just work the high coordination element really well, and that will raise the ships up. So I think about that. I think it's I mean, I think that's what we're all pulling towards, And so with all this being said, I wanted to ask you talked about your protocol. So with all these things that you've researched and studied and looked at, what is the protocol looking like for giving athletes their best shot at staying healthy from a hamstring perspective?
Yeah, so our cohort is, I want to emphasize this, that we're looking at football, so soccer players, that is. And therefore, some things that we find here won't maybe apply to other populations, because I see a lot of extrapolation. We were discussing about sprint technique, and some things might not be relative or predictive anymore in other cohorts, such as let's say rugby players, where there's a lot of hamstring injuries too, but there might be different mechanics. So I really want to emphasize that my PhD focuses on soccer. So therefore, these are the categories that we have of interest in this context. And we have the four main categories that we thought would realistically fit into schedules and screening protocols. So that would be posterior strength testing. And then we have range of motion. Then we have lumbopelvic control. And the last one is sprint mechanical output testing. And many of these components, so you could, they kind of are connected in many sense. So as an example, we're measuring force output in the sprint during sprinting. Technically, that's a strength measure, but yet it's separate from the strength measurements that we're doing in isolation. So, but I still want to emphasize that these things are most we believe independent, but they are related also to each other.
Cool. So yeah, so the lumbopelvic, is that measured kind of how you were talking before with like the marker, or how? Because that's the one that kind of sticks out to me is how you could look at it in the weight room. You could look at it with, I guess, like what you were talking about, or like where the feet are in running. How does that shake out in the protocol?
Yeah, so currently we have focused on aspects that are seeing how the pelvis moves in gait, and or indirectly try to predict how the pelvis moves during sprinting, due to we don't have the technology available that could measure it accurately and quickly during sprinting itself. But we're trying to get an idea of dynamic movement, so it's not just measuring that static position. And biggest emphasis would be anterior pelvic tilt in this population, as there seems to be a bias towards this position, and therefore this causes the hamstrings to have to do more stabilizing work, and which is in the theory is it's not very sustainable. So this would be require a higher lumbopelvic control, or this region of muscle balancing to cause a higher stability would be very important, so that some load could be taken off from the hamstrings.
With the sprint mechanics or the sprint power, so how are you? Is it like vertical and horizontal force? Like, is it in a fly or acceleration? Like, tell me a little bit more about that, and if you've seen any correlations there.
Right. So we are trying to, what's maybe innovative in our approach is that we're trying to combine macroscopic and microscopic biomechanical measures with cheap technology. So macroscopic would be that larger picture, the mechanical picture of how much horizontal force is being produced. And this is done by using the field method of Piers Amencino and JB Morin. Really effective and quick to do. And actually, a recent tweet by JB stated that this could maybe in the future be done in situ. So just measuring the players when they're doing their sport and get an idea of their force velocity profile. But this is a mechanical variable, so it's not, or a macroscopic variable, so it's not telling us how they're producing that horizontal force. So then we would want to zoom in a bit and emphasize how they are sprinting. And this, as most injuries take place during upright sprinting, we are isolating that component and trying to look at the kickback mechanism and trying to get an indirect idea of, let's say, are they running in a position of constant end range in terms of hip extension reserve. So they're constantly overextending and really working the hamstrings at longer lengths. So you would probably have unsustainable, well, if the volume was increased, especially unsustainably, this would be a big issue.
Sure. It makes me think about too, I wonder, some of those field tests are probably like you said, it's to the macro test can tell you the what, but it doesn't tell you the how. I know, a lot of people look at like how far is that foot traveling behind the body. I'd be interested in like shin angle change too, like how the shin angle changes to help create the lever by which the horizontal force is going to be applied. And I mean, it's hard. It's probably going to be really hard though to really like, you'd have to sit there and analyze and look at like all sorts of different running. I mean, it would be, it's just another, variable. But I think that to me, it's almost the principle, the overwhelming principle is just body imbalance. The ellipse of the run is in balance, and the body can control their pelvis and those types of things.
Exactly.
It is a complex, like it can be really complex though. I mean, we could like just take this down to the micro level. And so I guess it's always good to kind of have this resting, like larger view by which to process it all.
Yeah, and we should also emphasize that the football cohort, they're going to inevitably be different than track and field athletes, just because there's more requirement of accelerating in an upright position. And this idea, Hawk and Anderson emphasized to me that the requirements of acceleration are different. So they have to try to get that force from extending more in many situations. So there's going to be a bias of that movement, natural to the sport. We're just really trying to see that is there things that we can do that they're avoiding to touching constantly end range motion in these tasks. And the following future progression would be just having constant data, kind of like GPS data is now getting in more detail, more important data of acceleration and deceleration amounts and max velocity. Where Jason Weber, I believe, in the AFL, he's doing his PhD on, he's trying to look more accurately at changes in their technique during practice. So maybe, let's say someone's foot contacts or stride lengths maybe start to change suddenly from one week to another. And maybe that's a key metric there, that, there a change in their normal way of moving is the issue. So that's very interesting. And I think all these type of things needs to be really looked at, that we make it more a part of the training, the testing.
Yeah, in the last podcast that just went out, Joel Reinhardt was talking about looking at elite level soccer players, and basically some of them who stood out in the fact that they would be running in the open field and their mechanics would change to more like a track runner. And then they would get back on the ball and they'd kind of start to exhibit more soccer type emotions. I haven't spent time watching this, so I can't only say from just speculating, but it strikes me that I feel like athletes who are more well-rounded earlier in life, like they play different sports, maybe they run track, maybe they spend a lot of time playing on the playground and not just playing their sport all year, but I wonder if just playing one sport, like you said, like maybe soccer or, having a ball involved or another player involved might lend you to push more longer than, front side stuff is not going to be as emphasized just because of the nature of things. So just building a more robust runner, I wonder how, like, what you did as a young athlete plays into that and what exposure you have to different means of running and locomotion.
Yeah, I do absolutely believe that we can produce better postures and motions or movement in terms of the sprint technique, but it has to start, as you were saying, like at a young age, and be realistic to carry over to that level. So it's really difficult to start to change this on a professional level. This is what we're measuring right now, is our intervention also changing this stuff? But we will see. It might also just, the work we're doing with the wickets and the lumbopelvic control exercise that are specific to sprint positions, maybe they just will more have a positive influence because it's stimulating a position they're not used to. Mm-hmm. So there's some balancing going on there, that they're not constantly stimulating the same patterns that they're doing on the field. So there's a risk of overuse then. So from that perspective, it's also interesting that what we're doing is, but we can't really show that if that's happening.
Yeah, it's I definitely agree with filling that kind of bucket of, if you're a team sport athlete, go doing fly 10s or maybe fly 10s over like small wickets and stuff, just to stimulate a style of running that's not so one-sided that you might be running in your team sport, perhaps. I know our time is getting short, so I want to ask you the last question here real quick or two. Just quickly, posterior chain training. I mean, that's like an answer that's always pretty simple on the surface. People, it's like, oh, here's the exercise that this group is using to predict and whatever. But just posterior chain thoughts on strength-wise for athletes and things that they should be able reasonably to be able to do.
So here, I would directly off the bat want to emphasize that this would also include the triceps suralis or the ankle, but in our protocol, it doesn't because of time constraints, but we still want it to be trained. But then it would be then ideally the ankle joint, the knee and the hip, and even the lower back needs to be considered here. And Jordan Menguches tried to emphasize this point where we have to start considering in these kind of cohorts where there's such a bias towards muscles wanting to pull the pelvis in an anterior direction that we have to also, the erector spina, for example, that's highly stimulated through squatting patterns also. So if we're squatting in the gym, bilateral squatting, there's a lot of activation probably of that muscle group. So we're gaining maybe some good increases in torque or force production from the glutes with the squats, but that also contributes to posterior pelvic tilt, which is great. But then we're equally stimulating the erector spinae, which pulls it in the opposite direction. So these kind of small, smart considerations where maybe unilateral squats are smarter in this cohort, just from that also perspective, not just necessarily just from the transfer to performance perspective. That's some separate discussion, but also in terms of that intramuscular, where you're considering that what muscles are also pulling in what direction and in what ratios you're stimulating them during the movement. So from that standpoint, maybe having a bias towards split squats is smarter in this cohort, just to reduce some emphasis on the erector spinae. And posterior chain wise, again, if you can stack these exercises, so an exercise that stimulates a couple of important muscles, like let's say adductor manganus and the glutes, would be stimulated in a deeper squat or a parallel squat. And you would also emphasize some, let's say, it's good to consider what's going on with the antagonist. So of course, quads need to be trained in football or soccer, but there might be some interesting discussions here where to what ratio you're stimulating them. So I discussed this really shortly with Brett Contreras, and he thought it was an interesting idea where we really should consider in the squat patterns or even the deadlift pattern. Well, deadlift is an obvious one, but the ratio of movement between the hip and knee. So in a squat or a split squat, I can do it in a different manner. I can do it, let's say, knee dominant split squat, where there's more range of motion movement from the knee joint compared to the hip, or I can do it the other way around, where there's more trunk lean and less, let's say, forward and shift of the knee. So there's more range of motion movement from the hip in relation to the knee. And this, I think it's a smarter decision in terms of stacking and having good ratios of intramuscular stimuli in the important muscle groups. So we're getting posterior chain with the emphasis on the hip, and we're still getting knee stimuli, but it's or a knee extensor stimuli, but it's not as much, and therefore you're not promoting an increased HQ ratio where the quads are continually stronger, much stronger than the hamstrings. So I think this should be discussed as one source, and then of course just getting some isolated work there. It's just easier to guarantee that you're doing a really no other muscles are compensating for the hamstrings. So you're really making the constraints so that, the hamstrings are very likely the only group that could really work in these constraints. So glute ham raises and Nordics or these slider types of exercises are quite smart. And in some of these exercises, again, like we discussed earlier, you can get more detail about the movement choices they want to make. And hip thrust is an interesting one also, with good ratios between knee and hip stimuli. So that's my answer to that. Hopefully that was somewhat clear.
Sure. Yeah, I think about the glute ham and the Nordic too. And one thing I've been doing with those exercises a lot in the past year is making sure that an athlete has like they might do a glute ham with like a little medicine ball, like in kind of their stomach area, so that they get feedback so that they can't arch their back into the glute ham. I mean, it's just interesting to watch athletes who, I don't know how you do it for a Nordic, because it's hard enough as it is. Like it's now I have a medicine ball too, and I mean you could do. I like the Brett Contreras actually mentioned, he talked about the bent hip Nordic, where you bend at the hip forward, and I like that because I feel like that at least it probably changes the length of the hamstrings, maybe in a good way, but you also can't like arch that back. Well, you can, but you can't. You're not going to arch the back as much to fight the way down. It at least creates a little different. And it's probably more like if you took that bent hip Nordic and you flipped it 360 so the torso is vertical, maybe it would look more like that terminal swing face. So just as you're talking, I'm just realizing how much I really do like that variation. I program that probably about half the time in my Nordic array. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's maybe that, I don't know how you could measure the hip in that angle exactly, but I don't know. I think it's an interesting situation. So I know we're out of time though, and shoot, I feel like I had something to say with something you had said a while ago, but that's okay. Yeah, some range of motion, that's okay. Well, I know you got to get going. I do appreciate your time. Thanks for making this happen, Johan, and it was great talking to you. I appreciate your knowledge, sharing your knowledge with the hamstring space. That wraps up another show. Thanks for being here with us, and we will see you all next week.